I'm Dr. Sandra Yoakum, University Professor of Faith and Culture and a faculty member in the Religious Studies Department at the University of Dayton. This recording is part of a collection of conversations on what I find to be this endlessly fascinating topic of the relation between faith and culture. For this particular conversation, I am joined by Father James Heft, a priest in the Society of Mary, or as we like to say, the Marianists, and one of the premier leaders for almost 3 decades in Catholic higher education. He spent many years at the University of Dayton. He served as the chair of the theology department for 6 years, provost of the university for 8 years, and then chancellor and university professor of faith and culture for 10 years. He left the university in 2006 to found the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, where he now serves as the Alton Brooks Professor of Religion. And until last year, he was president of the Institute. He is now president emeritus and founder. He has written and edited 13 books and published over 175 articles and book chapters. He started obviously when he was like 12 or 13, I think. Most recently, he edited Learned Ignorance, Intellectual Humility Among Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and Catholicism and Interreligious Dialogue, and co-edited with University Professor of History, Una Cadogan, in The Logos of Love, Promise and Predicament in Catholic Intellectual Life. His book, Catholic High Schools, Facing the New Realities, was listed as a bestseller in a recent Oxford catalog. In 2011, the Association of Catholic Colleges and Universities awarded him the Theodore M. Hesburgh Award for his long and distinguished service to Catholic higher education. And he is very close to completing a book on Catholic higher education, as well as an edited book on issues around what the phrase, I think you called it, empty churches. As a professor at USC, he teaches a course on the history of US Catholic immigrants and leads a seminar entitled Religions and Violence for seniors who are majoring in international relations. So as you can tell, it's perfect to have a conversation around faith and culture. So welcome, Father Heft. And I want to begin our conversation by asking you to provide some insight into the title that my particular office bears, that is the University Professor of Faith and Culture. What were you hoping to communicate about each of these terms and the relationship to each other by founding an office that really addresses these issues?
Thank you, Sandra. I remember the title coming out of a conversation with the then President Ray Fitz that was pretty much based upon John Paul II. Because John Paul II regularly spoke about the critical importance of faith and culture. What happens when faith is not enculturated? It doesn't somehow take root in a culture from which it draws the best and from which it distances itself a bit. But the other idea that's connected to it that became even clearer towards the end of his long pontificate was this emphasis on the new evangelization.
Okay.
And there were a number of people scratching their heads initially when that phrase was circulated a lot. But I think it's come to be clear that one of the problems, even within the Catholic Church, not talking about somehow faith here and then culture there, or the church here and then the rest of the world, is that the culture is everywhere. Nobody is apart from the culture. No one would have a language or an identity if they didn't participate in a culture. But there are dimensions of the culture in the West, the North Atlantic, that are extremely powerful. And they tend to privatize religion, not destroy it. So the old secularization thesis has proven not to be true. But the nature of religion is pretty much transformed. It's fine as long as you keep it private. You don't want it into the public sphere. And I think that is almost impossible for Muslims and for Christians if they understand their basic mission. And given the fact that Muslims constitute second largest group of believers and Christians, the largest group. And it's absolutely crucial we begin to try to understand how you engage the culture and the faith. So in this country, for example, I always say, well, I believe in the separation of church and state, but I do not believe in the separation of religious influence from the public forum.
Okay.
So
yes.
that's critical. So right on from the beginning was this awareness of the gap. There's a second gap that I think exists that is not directly related, but indirectly related to faith and culture. And that is the extent to which through the 60s, 70s, and I think even into the 80s, the academic study of theology related to a serious concern about culture coupled with evangelization was pretty much absent. Since that time, there's a much greater awareness, fueled in part by the concern for the environment, with the larger sense of the relationship of the faith and what the faith has to say to the world, not just to Catholics and so on. So this expands the conversation in a way that I think has been very rich. And I think the Catholic tradition is very well positioned to enter into that conversation with something really to contribute, even before the magnificent circular Laudato Si.
Yeah.
So those have been real changes that have gone over the last 40 years that I've been watching. And one of the really benefits of getting old, I'll be 78.
There's so many. Oh, wow. Thanks.
I'll be 70. What do you mean, oh, wow? I'll be 70 and 78 in February. Is that you do have a sense of things moving and you can see it. So those are some of the questions that came into my mind right away when I was talking about faith and culture. And it's not a question of how to evangelize the culture only. It's also how to understand the culture, how to learn from the culture. And I mean, one of the great things about Laudato Si is you have the creed. I believe in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth. All right. We're going to see, in my mind, over the next 100 years, more of a development of doctrine about that statement, creator, creation, the world, the gift of the environment, the obligation and responsibility to protect it for the future generations. I think it's going to be a great vehicle for evangelization in the most expansive and comprehensive way that we've seen in a long time. Mm-hmm. So that's what I saw, not as clearly then, but those are some of the things that I saw when I came into this position first in 1996.
So here's a question I have when I think about this. Like, I think a lot of people would have been tempted to call it religion and culture. But you called it faith, and you all decided faith and culture.
Sure. I don't know what anybody's talking about when they talk about religion. I don't know what that is. So I tell my students here regularly, when they mention religion, what are we talking about? We talk about Christianity? Yeah, Christianity. Well, what form of Christianity are we talking about? And almost always what's in the media, if you see a conflict, for example, between science and religion,
right?
It's not science and religion, it's science and conservative Protestants. So religion, actually, we know historically was a term that was kind of created in the 17th century. Mm-hmm. It didn't exist before because it was like fish and water, it was just Christianity. So it's already a kind of abstract term that unless you break it down and try to understand concretely what it means in relationship to whatever topic you're talking about, you're not going to get anywhere with it. Similarly, culture varies immensely. One of the reasons when we were looking for a location for the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies, so this goes back to actually 2002, 2003, had Charles Taylor, David Tracy, had any number of really fascinating people on this committee that were, really into it and remain friends and advisors to me in various ways. But we had 3 finalists for the location of the Institute, and this is significant in terms of culture and faith. One was Princeton University, one was Yale, and the third was the University of Southern California. And when the subcommittee brought those three back to the whole committee, I said to myself, Southern California, what are you talking about? Princeton and Yale, wow. Well, for various reasons, Princeton didn't work out. And they were pretty obvious from the beginning in terms of the Catholics that were interested in the Institute at Princeton were too involved in what are called the culture wars. I have no interest in liberal Catholicism, conservative Catholicism. I want first-rate studies, trying to understand things. Yale has a tremendous campus ministry, but we would be connected with campus ministry. We're not campus ministry. We're a research institute. And therefore, what did USC have? USC understood, this was so fascinating, they understood really well our mission. A part of the reason they did is because John Noonan was a close friend and working on this, was on my board, and he educated his close friend, Kevin Starr, the historian, was on the faculty at USC, and they talked to administration and they explained things so that by the time a delegation came out to Los Angeles to talk with the administration at a dinner, it was amazing how much they understood us. But what's the benefit? The benefit is we live in one of the most pluralistic cities.
Yes.
Even in the Catholic community here, Mass is celebrated in over 50 languages every Sunday. COVID time is a little complicated here, and then we're at the doorway of Latin America and we're on the Pacific Rim. Those are all new dimensions that if we located in the Northeast, not to say that there are not immigrants and so on in the Northeast, but nothing compared to the reality here. So the cultures are diverse. They're in many locations. I mean, we have a neighborhood of immigrants from Belize, almost 15,000 people there. We have Koreatown. We have all kinds of things here that I love Dayton. I love the University of Dayton, but I'll tell you, I ain't seen nothing like this.
No.
And it's been fascinating. And it's couple that with a serious commitment to interreligious dialogue, and particularly with Islam and Judaism. So you could call them the Abrahamic religions and so on, though exact relationship to Abraham is really different for each religion. And you have, I think, another broadening of what you think through or what you have to think about when you do the study of cultures. I just came back December. I was in Africa for a couple of weeks, and I was invited. There was a month-long symposium that happens every 3 years, either in Africa or in India for young Marianists. So there are about 40 of them there. And they have different speakers come in and so on. And they had asked me to speak about Christianity and Islam. Because in India and in Africa, it's very difficult. You've got the Hindu nationalist movement under Modi, who was reelected by a big margin, the prime minister, and that's very much aimed at Muslims, they're foreigners, and then it hits Christians too, as a kind of indirect problem. But in Africa, you've got these terrorist groups and so on. So how to understand that, and some of our brothers are experiencing it in a very real way, how not to become polarized and totally negative, not be naive and saying, oh, well, let's just sit down and talk, we'll have a dialogue. That's an education for me. And all I have found is that the work I've been in, and I thank the Marianists for allowing me to do this, though I left UD with a heavy heart. I just said, this is something I've got to try because I could see it as critically important, and I think I can do this much better somewhere else. You know, so it's just been this constant pushing out in many directions. And so here through the Institute, we continue to do that kind of serious consideration of religions, more specifically, specific religions, branches of religions. I mean, The unfortunate thing in the media today, you'd be hard pressed to ask anybody who watches, whether it's CNN or Fox News, doesn't matter which spectrum, part of the spectrum, to understand the difference between a Sunni and a Shia.
Yes.
What difference does that make? And they would say, Sharia law, that's terrible. Well, what about canon law? I mean, are they really so different? We don't impose canon law on somebody who's not, and the vast majority of Muslims have no interest in imposing Sharia law on anybody but other Muslims. So these are things that I think I have learned, and then I don't know that I would have learned as well as I have learned if I were in a different setting, which is not to say I continue to believe Dayton, University of Dayton, really does a really good job. And I do get around to a lot of Catholic universities. So I want to hold the flag up for UD very strongly.
So you kind of touched on this. So tell me, like, I don't know, two of the biggest transformative perspectives from being in Southern California at your institute, that from where you came, here at UD, thinking about faith and culture, and now, almost 2 decades of experience where you are now.
I would say it's an interesting question. First answer I would have is friendship. It's really clear that there are intellectual dimensions and spiritual dimensions, both, to interreligious dialogue. But there's nothing that opens up the door to a genuine encounter more than friendships with people who of a very different faith, and listening and evaluating and trusting and all those things. Absolutely crucial. So, John Henry Newman, one of my favorite authors, referred to the crisis as not of faith, the crisis of his imagination. Pope Francis talks about, and he uses the word all the time, encounter. And Newman talks about the heart, speaks to the heart. There is this dimension which I think it runs the risk of being underestimated in academic circles. So interreligious dialogue has opened up to me much more clearly the critical foundational dimension of friendship as a key to understanding. It's another way of saying, more academically, the ethical is key to the epistemological. How you live and how you relate opens up a lot of what you will understand. So that's one thing. The second thing is a little bit more focused on being at USC, and that is, I'm I think the only priest of a faculty of 4,000 people at USC, and it does seem rather odd to a number of people because I'll wear my collar regularly on campus. And I had the experience a couple of years ago, some faculty member, I don't know who he was probably Catholic, but he came up and says, "Hey, Father, where's your parish?" I said, "I don't have a parish." He says, "Really? Well, what do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm a teacher." He says, "Oh, over at Loyola Marymount?" I said, "No, here." And it was like I had made some terrible mistake or something. But I find two things. I find, I would say this, USC is neither secular nor sectarian. It's not secular in the sense that it takes the spiritual thing. They have a dean for religious life who's a Hindu and a very good friend and someone you should talk to about faith and culture.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I have two more too. And another one is that it's not sectarian in the sense that it takes the study of religions seriously. Now, I've argued that any good Catholic theology department should be in conversation with other religions, so that it's a false dichotomy to say, well, religious studies versus theology. That's just too superficial. But what I have found is a number of people who would describe themselves as secular, but very interested and very curious about a presentation of a faith tradition that has some intellectual ballast to it. So I haven't felt odd here. I haven't. And the description, I don't know, there may be universities that are hostile to faith. And there are surely at many universities faculty members who might be hostile to faith. But I think a lot of people in the academy are privatized religionist people. And they don't come out easily.
Right.
And because the overall atmosphere tends to be in the academy more secular than the culture at large. Charles Taylor made that observation several times, and I think it's quite true. So I have found that to be the second thing that has been most fascinating for me. It would have been very different as a Marianist priest at the University of Dayton, where the Marianists are, it's a very different experience.
Right. So we're coming to the end, sadly, because I could spend a lot longer talking about this and listening to you talk about it, actually. So the question that we like to end these conversations is, given all the challenges that we are facing right now in the country and in the world, not the least of which is the pandemic, what gives you hope?
Well, I hope we find a way to contain this epidemic, for sure, pandemic. I hope that more people realize the responsibility that generations have to generations. I hope we realize that nursing homes are not the best solution to the elderly. That should become clearer than ever, and with certain adjustments in insurance policies, it could be arranged. A number of people have done these studies that people could be at home and cared for with hired help that would be less expensive. I mean, I would hope that the sense that we could build on the sense that we're all in this together, that we're really in this together. And the Pope's latest encyclical, which I'm reading with a group of young adults, by the way, Fratelli Tutti, says this in many ways in a very profound way. The notion of a nation state somehow answering this, or take the environment. There's no solution to this challenge unless it's some type of international agreement. So there are opportunities here that are unparalleled in history to take a next step. I'm not channeling Teilhard de Chardin, but I would say there's something here fascinating going on that could turn a page in the history of civilization as we've known it. Those are my limited hopes, but I think they're pretty exciting, and I look forward to how they might unfold, and I'd like to be some small contributor to it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Was a very inspiring way to end this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for asking.
You're welcome.
Carry on.